Danielle Cass, and I'm with Microsoft's Ethics and Society. So first, a huge thank you and props to Mia and the whole Women in AI Ethics team for organizing today's event, and huge kudos to all of you that have hung in there to this point. It's been a long day. Before we dive into harms modeling and how it's a practice you can apply tomorrow when you get back to the office to really build a foundation for ethical AI, I just have to say it's really amazing to see how the Women in AI Ethics Summit has grown since 2 years ago when, inspired by Mia's list of 100 brilliant women in AI ethics, my dear friend Kathy Baxter, who leads ethical AI at Salesforce, and I thought, what if we get all these women in a room together and see, let's collaborate. So we organized the first summit 2 years ago in a little conference room in Salesforce. Mia was there. We had 24 women. And so it's so amazing to see how Mia has grown this. So kudos and props to you. So speaking of sharing and learning from each other, it's really a treat for me now that we get to share with you the work that my colleague Harmony Mayberry is leading across Microsoft's cloud and AI product group. So Harmony is a principal PM and harms lead on our ethics and society team, which you heard a little bit about from Arthi. And she's going to walk you through this hands-on workshop and give you some tools you can use. And we have 5 amazing colleagues of Harmony's and Arthi's in mind to help you. We're going to kind of get into breakout sessions. So we have Catherine Pratt, Josie Young, Rachel Kellum, Sang-Hee Oh, and Sharon Lois. You'll see us popping in and out of the Zoom breakout rooms. So with that, I hand it over to Harmony to take you on this journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thanks, I'm really excited to be here and have this chance to share with all of you. So as Danielle said, what I'm going to do today, this is really where we get into like workshop and we'll have interactive sessions mode. So, as Danielle mentioned, so we work within, and as Arthi mentioned before in the panel, we work within the Cloud and AI group within Microsoft. And so really what that means is that we're embedded side by side working with the technology teams themselves, building tools, building techniques, trying things out. And one of our goals in doing that is to also be able to share with the community as well, because we know that a lot of this space is new. We're all learning, we're all developing new techniques, right, in this new space. And I was able to listen to some of the sessions along the way today, and there's so many great issues and considerations and areas that were brought up. And so those are all things that we try and bring into the table as we start applying these techniques to bring ethics like really tangibly and practically into product development. And so with that, what I'm going to do, so one of the things I wanted to start with, so a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight as I introduce this technique, and the first session, I'm going to introduce it kind of at a high level. Then we'll have a bit of an exercise so you'll have a chance to interact with it and engage with it. And then in the second hour, we'll actually have a chance to do it in more depth with small group exercises and breakout rooms. And so we'll have some chance. I want you all to have a chance to like really kind of feel with it, or feel it around, get a feel for it and work with it. And then we're also going to give you some resources and tools that you can take and then, like to Danielle, as Danielle said, take it back to your practice and apply it and interact with it and give us feedback on it, because that's really what we would love to have. And so as part of this harms modeling technique, context is incredibly important. So I want to start with explaining our context for how we came up with this and how we built it, because that influences the shape of it and the frame of it. And so kind of, Brad Smith was mentioned earlier for his work with the World Economic Forum. And so he is our president and chief legal officer. And he wrote a book really thinking about the socio-technical issues around this evolution of technology, what he calls sort of the 4th industrial revolution with AI, and really examining those. And I think all of us who work at Microsoft are very fortunate that as a company, they've chosen to put responsibility and ethics and intentionality really core to how we build technology and how we present technology into the world. So that's like first step. And also that they've invested in that. So they put money in funding teams with Arthi and I and all my colleagues who are on the call as well. That's like, we feel very fortunate and we feel very like lucky that the company is able to invest in that. And that's another reason why we want to be able to share that with others. The other important thing as we think about the context of how we built this tool and like where it comes from, it starts really from a standpoint, not only of that we have a responsibility for what we put out in the world and the impact that it has, but also that anything that we develop, any technology that we put into the world or make available to the world is not being dropped into a vacuum. It's being dropped into very complex social and societal structures, in processes, in, you know, the way people communicate, in the way people are productive, in the way that people think about the world and truth and all of those things. And so in order to effectively be able to build technology, we really need to be able to think very deeply and be very mindful about those contexts, recognizing that when we introduce something, it changes the context that it's interacting with. And so those are the areas that we really start from as our kind of starting point. Now, the other thing that's really important and that really comes out of this kind of ethos is that, I was going somewhere. Oh yeah, is that, shoot. Anyway, I'll get into that more. Oh yes, so is that the thing that we realize is that as technology builders, I think we're all kind of as an industry coming to a place of recognizing that this is really important, recognizing that intentionality and mindfulness and clear, tangible techniques are really important, but also recognizing that a lot of those techniques don't exist yet or have not existed yet. And so that's why we like focus really on what are these repeatable tools and processes and methods that we can apply and build. And that's really where harms modeling came from. The goal here is really to give tech builders, designers, engineers, data scientists, all sorts of disciplines that are involved in creating a technology to be able to have a technique they can apply to really anticipate how might this technology impact others, and put them in the mindset of understanding that they are not the end user, they are not the, you know, the ultimate person who is going, they can't predict necessarily, right? And so the goal here is to outline the space and help them kind of define this space and know where we need to go deeper, do more research, engage more with diverse populations. And so I mentioned context, and I'm going to keep mentioning context because it's incredibly important. So now as we start actually like applying this technique, I'm going to like dive into the ways that we do this and how we start to like dig into it. So one of the areas is the context of the technology itself, right? So technology capabilities, what is it that we're actually trying to, what is the technology making possible that wouldn't otherwise be possible? We heard from the panel a little bit before that sometimes it's like, is this really even a technical problem we're trying to address? Or is it even appropriate to apply technology? That's kind of one of the ways that we get to this, is thinking, what is unique about this technology? How does it enhance human capability, augment human capability? And then the other thing is like, really, what's the intended use? What is that problem or new thing that we're trying to make possible, very specifically? So what is it, the task that a human might want to do that it's going to augment? So as we work with product teams, it's all about defining these elements. And we want to define these starting from a positive place of saying like, knowing it's tech builders, we want to innovate and do cool things and change the world in a positive way, but we need to like define what that means, define what our goals are very specifically. How should it be used? How shouldn't it be used? And then we get into stakeholders. So for whom? Arthi talked a lot about this if you were on the panel before now. Really about, so the way we start to actually break out stakeholders or think broadly about this in a really structured way. One is project sponsors. So if you imagine the whole thing about follow the money and the money matters, like the people who are ultimately paying to use this technology or paying to have this technology created have a strategy, have a point of view that's going to influence the way that the technology is designed and the goals of the technology, what defines success. Then we think about the tech builders themselves. All of us have our own perspectives and our own ethos and our own kind of point of view that can influence the decisions we make throughout the technology design and development process. And it's important to recognize that. It's not that they don't exist, it's just important that we be very mindful of them and that we be very aware of them. Now I want to get into kind of the more maybe traditional areas that we often think about, which is around direct stakeholders. I call them direct actors because sometimes stakeholders doesn't resonate as well, but end users, who's actually going to be specifically engaging with the system. Then we think about more broadly, and Arthi touched a lot on this, but I think it's incredibly important. Who are the indirect actors who are going to be impacted by the system? So it may be people who will be subject to the decision of a system whose job will be fundamentally changed by the use of a system. People who be part of kind of their data is being collected to feed the system or train the system. Those are all potentially indirect actors who may have no idea even that the system is being used or how it works, or how it is influencing important core elements of their life. And so those are incredibly important to define these and think really broadly about these different areas and different elements. Now, the kind of fifth dimension I want to talk about is really vulnerable and marginalized populations. And so thinking about that, it's not that they are simultaneously fulfilling one of these roles as an indirect actor or a direct actor, maybe even a tech builder or a sponsor, but they also have dimensions that make them more susceptible to potentially having disproportionate impact from the technology. And so it's important to consider what that is, what elements, what kind of characteristics, what populations that may be. And those ones in particular, we want to make sure that we're engaging with and making sure that we're bringing their voice in as we're following this path towards building technology. And now the last element I want to touch on is this element around value systems. And so understanding that all of these different stakeholders we talked about, all of these different actors within the system have different value systems and different values that are important to them. And so what we want to do is try and understand those. And also, again, coming from that point of view that we are not them. And so we need to learn this and understand this and consider this by asking and engaging with those populations so that we can understand. And so that when we design, what we're doing is elevating those values, bringing those values to life and bringing those needs to life in a really tactical and tangible way within the system. So then the other dimensions that we think about when we start doing this analysis, and which is sort of like, that last slide is really about defining key important elements of the system that then when we do harms modeling, we have clearly in mind, and we can have a really rich understanding as we define what areas may cause harm and what that looks like and for who and how it impacts their values in a negative way. Now, the other dimensions that we need to touch on is around really kind of understanding fallibility of systems and understanding the different scenarios in which a system could cause harm. So one is sort of, I call unintended, but this is saying if the system does exactly what you planned for it to do, and the people within the system do exactly as you anticipated them doing, could it still cause unintentional harm? Are there still implications for people that you hadn't considered that could cause negative impact? Now, the second one is one of my favorites only because I love the beautifully, wildly diverse and different behaviors of humans. And so this one is really around, it's not that the users do the wrong thing. If they do something that we didn't anticipate when we designed the system, we didn't expect them to do it, then what could the system do? How could the system react to that in a way that might be harmful? So we need to explore that and really consider that. Because I think we like to think we have this sort of beautifully golden path in mind, and we have user journeys in mind, and we can do all these things, but we have to know people are very unpredictable, and that's beautiful and it's fascinating. But if the system's not prepared for that, it can cause them harm. The third one is really around system error. So kind of having our own sort of humbleness and understanding that no system is infallible, no system is perfect 100% of the time. And so recognizing that there will be errors. And when there are errors, we have to consider what could happen, how could someone potentially be harmed when the system has an error, and who might that be, and what would that look like, so that we can then plan for it. And then the last one is really around malicious use. So these powerful tools that we're building to be positively transformational in the system, in the world, in the systems that we deploy them into, are also potentially attractive tools for people who have goals or intentions or malicious uses or things that we would not want. And so we have to think about that, how might someone want to use this, again, in ways that we don't want them to? And then how might we prevent that? And so once we kind of have those lenses in place and have the system defined, then what we do in this harms modeling is we actually go through and look across a variety of categories and are very specific about defining harm statements, of saying across these categories. So for example, I might say risk of injury, and I might say it's a physical injury. So if in an industrial safety setting, someone is counting on the system to alert them to a hazard or a safety issue, and it fails, then people on the factory floor may be injured. Those are the kinds of statements. This is the way we start to like draw this out with specificity. So then we can think about, okay, well, one of the answers to that is we need to make sure that there are people in the loop and that they're able and like prepared to jump in and help, or help resolve that, or double check the system so that there aren't unchecked safety hazards. So this is how we start to walk through. Really systematically, we start looking at risks of injury. We look at denial of consequential services, housing, employment, education, across the broad spectrum. We want to be as thorough as we can so that we are being really thoughtful again about the context and the broad spectrum about human well-being and ways that technology can impact that negatively. Then we think about infringement on human rights. So we think a lot about dignity loss, loss of liberty, privacy, environmental impact, all these like really fundamental, foundational human rights that we want to be elevated, and we understand that there can be times there's a possibility for things to be impacted, and so we want to be really thoughtful about exploring that. Like, how might automation dehumanize people so that that kind of gets in the way or dehumanizes interactions between people because they're relying on a system and suddenly people are turned into numbers or data. And so we're very thoughtful about that and how we address that and how we resurface sort of the humanity and make sure that people on both sides of the system know that there are humans on both sides and impacted. And then the fourth, like, larger category is really thinking about the erosion of social and democratic structures. So thinking about how these systems used at broad scale can cause manipulation, misinformation, potentially impact our understanding of like truth and reality and our belief in what we see and hear. So that's the broad taxonomy that we use to explore these spaces. And then we don't want to just leave it there, of course. We want to then be able to take that and say, now that we've explored this broad spectrum of potential ways of harms, we have the specificity that may occur, let's think about what are the tools we have at our disposal that we can apply. Is it looking at data collection and model training? Arthi talked a lot about that earlier, about collecting data from diverse populations towards fairness. Things like system architecture and AI tooling, how the user experiences the tool, operators as well as others who may kind of just walk up to the system. We want to be very clear and very conscious about how we communicate the system to them and how we have them interact with it, so that, again, we're minimizing harm and we're elevating those positive outcomes. We also think a lot about deployment and user guidance. So especially with a lot of our tools, we put them in the world, people take them and they use them and they build on them, and we want to infuse them and share with, we want to infuse that ecosystem with an understanding of ways to do this in an ethical and responsible way. And so we provide lots of guidance on how to do that. And then there's also the element of who should have access to this. What are the appropriate uses? Who should be able to kind of engage with this technology? And then kind of one of the other areas is thinking about like public policy. Are there positions we should advocate for as a company based on our insights on how the technology works? So these are just some examples. I'm sure there are lots more, and I'd love to hear what other people have tried, what you've experimented with. But this kind of gives you a sense for how we think about this and how we move really towards framing and shaping technology through the insights we get from harms modeling. Okay. So what I want to do now is actually walk through a case study together. And so I'll say up front that the case study that we're going to use is a real world case study from the New York Times. It does involve domestic violence, but it doesn't get into strong depth about violence or depictions in that way, but I just want to give everyone a heads up on that. And so a couple of years ago, the New York Times featured this article, and I think it woke probably a lot of people up about, who've been sort of excited about automation and automation in the home and all these like interesting, efficiencies we can drive and cool things that we can do. And then what they ended up starting to hear from people who were serving populations who were victims of domestic violence was that a lot of people were coming to them experiencing manipulation of these devices, not understanding how they work. And the service providers didn't know how they work either, and didn't know how to help them take over control of the systems again. And so we have this case study. I'm going to walk this one through together, and I'll walk you through kind of the flow about how we would do a pretty high level harms assessment on this. And then I'm going to present you all with a case study. So I just want to prepare you all for that, so you'll jump in and do some shortly. So if we take this example of former domestic partners, former spouses, one partner who set the system up, he's very familiar with it, he did all the passwords, he has all the apps, put in, you know, heating and cooling, lighting controls, you know, sound system, all of that stuff in the home. And he and his partner are now split, and there was domestic violence, domestic abuse among the relationship. It's a you know, contentious split. And the partner who's still in the home, Alaya, she's still in the home that they shared together, but she doesn't know how to actually control the systems. She doesn't know how they work. She doesn't have the apps on her phone. She doesn't know the passwords. And now she's experiencing things like her lights going on in the middle of the night, music going on, waking her up. She has like the heat and the air conditioning is going to extremes at different times of the day. And so this is a scenario that we want to consider. And so here's how we'd start to break it down. So we want to start with like, what's the value and the goal of this technology? What are the intended uses? Who's it for? And then start thinking about harms. And then we start thinking about mitigations. Cool, okay. So the way that we'd start to break this one down is that we'd start with the uses and the values definition, because we do want to always kind of keep in mind, like, what's the goal of this tech? What problems are that? What's the optimistic kind of benefits that we're aiming for? And so if we imagine, so we know why a lot of people adopt this tech. It's usually around, you know, using less power in the home. Perhaps you have environmental, you know, sustainability concerns or interests, saving money by not having things run when you don't want it to be running, feeling more secure that you can check on your home when you're not there, efficiencies of being able to let your guests come in and out, or let people who need to work on home, just kind of being able to let them in and not having to rush home to be there. So that's the positive path, and that's important again for us to keep in mind. And then we start thinking about, well, who's that for? That's usually probably a homeowner or a renter, occupants. Maybe it helps you let your children, you know, in when they get home from school. If you're not there, you can just kind of lay out the code, or you could just remotely let them in. Other guests or visitors from out of town, that sort of thing, right? Home repair providers. So those are one set of stakeholders. Those are kind of the core stakeholders that we're considering. And then what we want to think about is on the harm side. So I kind of touched on them a little bit in the case study, but the way that we start to think about this is to say, so potentially I mentioned sort of like lights on in the middle of the night, disrupting sleep, heat and cooling disruptions and extremes that may disrupt sleep, or just otherwise sort of harassing and terrorizing you, right? As a human in the home, not being able to control your systems. Excuse me. So those are the things we start to explore, right? To say like, okay, so these are different tools, these are the different things in the system. This is how it could be used to harass remotely. And then we start to think about other things, like if you have any of these tools that have a microphone or have a remote listening, could it be turned on when you're not, like, without someone knowing? Could someone be sort of like surveilling your home and then use that for stalking, or use that for harassment, or get information that you thought was private within your home? We also think about potentially things like using a smart speaker, right? Turn it the other way and being able to speak into the home, you know, have messages, etc., being able to harass remotely. So those are the core kind of harms areas that we came up with in the space. And now, then we start thinking about mitigations. And so we start thinking about things like, how do we help people to inform and think about changes that may be necessary to protective orders, and how protective orders are structured in terms of like remote harassment or technology like based harassment, of kind of changing the boundaries or expanding the definition, so it's not just physical space between people, but also the sort of technological reach outs. Then we think about things like, how would you how would you fulfill what people want from this technology in terms of security and things like that, but also give someone a way that they can kind of like reset it or take over control if they need to, and make that easy and make it easy for people to also understand how to do that. Then we also think about things like, how would someone know if it was being kind of activated remotely? How can we let people know that? Even, you know, care providers or service providers in your home may want some indication that something is watching them or recording them. We feel like that's important as well. So we think about things like that. And then we think about things like, specifically for this population, for the groups that are providing service and help for people who are experiencing domestic violence, how do we help train them on whatever it is we've implemented in the technology? So it's never just, let's fix the system. Sometimes it is a technology change, but it's also, how do we guide people to know how to use it, to know how to engage with it? So that's the high level about how we do this. And before I transition, I see lots of flashing, so I just want to check in with folks if there's questions or things I should be jumping in on. And we have a bunch of anything.
There was a good question from Lila Toplick in the chat, if you wanted to take a look at that one. Sharon did a great job addressing another question.
Oh, okay. Would you mind reading it?
Yeah, if I can get back there. My thing got weird. Okay. Yeah, actually, Lila, why don't you ask it and introduce yourself, because you're kind of an awesome person too. Okay, maybe she's doing so. I'll read it then until she comes back. She's a good person to know in this world, Lila Toplick.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was trying to unmute.
Yeah,
right.
there you go. And show us your
Danielle.
face.
Hi, Harmony. Thank you for this presentation. I was just thinking about a question that came up in some of the discussions we've been having regarding the data that might be coming from marginalized populations, and wanted to get your perspective on this topic of building responsibly and how you think about fairness and harms vis-a-vis the people whose data is being actually used to train the models, who might or may not be actually benefiting from the final solution. So what's our responsibility to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a big area actually that we talk about when we start exploring these systems and the harms modeling. One of the kind of core questions we ask as we start kind of diving into this is, where is the data coming from? Is it, you know, what populations are you collecting from? How are you doing that? Are you doing that in an ethical manner where people understand what they're being asked and what it's going to be used for? You know, are people being compensated if it's like a broad collection, and treated fairly, and again, and being given like transparency and being able to really understand what it's being used for? The other thing, so that's kind of like the rights of people we're collecting data from that we definitely dive into and talk a lot about. The other element too is around the diverse voices. So one of the elements when we talk about data and collecting for fairness, one of the ways that we use harms modeling is through that stakeholder exercise. We really try and think broadly about, you know, what are the characteristics or populations that may be impacted. That's one of the ways that we highlight. These are the communities that we think we need to potentially collect more, you know, look at fairness for, or potentially collect data from. So that's one of the ways that we kind of like help to explore and kind of define that space better. Any other ones jumping out?
Nope, that's good. We can dive into the hands-on portion. You're doing awesome.
Awesome. Okay, so hopefully everyone, and Danielle, did everybody get the file? I'm hoping people got the PDF of this.
We'll send it out now, Harmony.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So he's going to get this. Josh will get this out to you all. I'll walk through it first. And then what I'm going to do is hand it over to everybody, give everyone a little bit of time to do some solo working. And then we're going to share back, because I would love to hear kind of your insights as you kind of walk through the same pattern of what I just presented. So we're going to do a new case study. This case study is really about a large corporation comes to you as a tech builder and says, hey, we want to build this, we want to have some tool that will help us monitor employee morale and well-being. And we really want to like help empower our managers and help empower our HR to understand like how they can address, you know, how everyone is actually doing and how we might kind of have interventions and help with kind of driving more wellness among our employees. And so the way that they propose doing this is using computer vision and kind of analyzing expression and using basically the camera in your laptop or the camera in your conference room to do facial analysis and skeletal tracking and kind of try and have an analysis around emotions and posture and what that says about your body language, etc., what that says about your well-being in the workplace. And then being able to take that, use that for insights for interventions potentially, or help, or nudges, or engaging with your employees. Now, one of the engineers and your team says, hey, I have doubts on the accuracy of emotion detection, because what does that mean exactly? And I'm not sure that I would feel comfortable with this kind of thing happening to me if I were an employee. So this is the thing, right? So I'm feeling like this feels a little bit like surveillance. And so what we want to do is kind of take this perspective as our starting point, take this case study as your starting point. And what we want to do is actually go through that, do the activity kind of like I just outlined before. So start by thinking, putting your own lens, put your own thoughts on defining the value of the technology. Sort of saying, okay, how might this be positive? What might be some good applications? How could this be beneficial? Thinking about who the variety of stakeholders and different characteristics within, right? Think about within the manager population as a category, but then there's lots of different variation within a manager population, or employees, right? There's a broad spectrum of characteristics and attributes that are really important to consider within employees. Then on the second part, you can start thinking about harms. So how might this be negative for people, and for whom, and what does that look like? And then start brainstorming on recommended mitigations. What are the ways, are there ways to shape this technology to make it better? Are there ways to understand it better, to convey and reassure employees, etc.? So I'm going to give everyone, unless anyone has any questions on the activity, I'd love to give everyone about, let's see, we'll do like 15 minutes for just some like thinking engagement time. And then I would love for us all to come together and have people share out and chat. I'll try and read through that. The moderators or people can come off mute. I guess the crowd is not prohibitively large, so people can actually come off mute and we can share your insights on the different sections.
So to be clear, everybody, in the chat, there is a PDF document called Anticipating Human Impacts. You should click on that, open it, and spend the next dozen minutes or so reading it, thinking through. And if you have questions while it's happening, you can use the chat or come off mute, and then we'll come back as a group, and Harmony will guide us through this interactive hands-on harms modeling so you can start to learn to use these skills yourself.
Awesome. Okay, so let me bring the case study back up. Okay. So I'd love, so if people can, I'd love, if people want to, let's go, there's a hand raising feature in Zoom, or Zoom, I don't think. So if you have something you'd like to share, if you can drop it in the chat, and then I will call on folks, and then I'd love for, I'll help unmute you. And I'd love for you to share your perspectives directly. I want to stop screen sharing actually so I can see humans.
So some people need a little bit more time.
Oh, okay.
So why don't we, if you're ready, start getting active and sharing your thoughts. Raise your hand or just flag and Harmony can unmute you. And if you need a little more time, please go ahead and take as much time as you need. This is a dense material, and it's important to really, absorb it.
Okay. Katrina, would you like? Oh, okay. Katrina, would you like to share your thoughts? I see some really good stuff there.
It looks like Katrina is still on. There we go. Yay.
Hey everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty scary scenario that you painted, and it totally reminds me of the panopticon where you're always being watched. So, I mean, I kind of don't even really want to salvage this in terms of how to mitigate some of the harms, but I suppose on the good side, what the company is trying to do is sort of figure out how people are responding, if they have ergonomic work situations, and maybe for the intention of bringing more resources to support people. So that could be the good side of things. But it doesn't take much to imagine all of the harms of watching people, the anxiety of always being watched, of always being on, of penalizing people for how they react, their facial expressions and so forth. So I don't see a lot of good in this technology.
For sure. It sounds like you're thinking a lot about from the employee perspective in this case, right? Being under that spotlight all the time, being analyzed, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I understand those reactions. I'd love some others. What were some of the other ones? Looks like Layla, would you like to share some of your thoughts?
Absolutely, happy to. I was also equally scared of this type of technology. Although it made me wonder, now that we're all working remotely, whether actually that could be helpful for many people who are just getting adjusted to working remotely. So I think there's this question of consent and who actually gets to see that data and where that data goes. So a couple of harms that I thought about specific to the biometric aspect of the data that's being collected. One is reliability of biometric-based identification, just in terms of skin color, gender, age group, facial recognition on ethnic and or facial expressions on different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. How do we codify whether somebody is stressed or not stressed if they're coming from different parts of the world and have a different way of expressing emotions? Privacy. I've seen that with also biometric data too, and biometric databases, is that databases could be hacked and biometric data could be stolen and correlated with other data that's out there about us. Obviously concerns about the abuse of biometric data, whether it's infringement on the rights and values through surveillance or reuse without consent, because we don't know if this company will be bought by somebody else or the government will request that data and what will happen with it.
Yeah, lots of great thoughts about what happens to that data and whether you can even be accurate enough to make it like fair or about, even if you wanted to do that sort of thing, right? Could it even be accurate or fair? And then you're right, that's always a big one when I talk to teams, is like, if you are creating this stockpile of really valuable data, it's going to be valuable to other people too, who may want to act, right? And like thinking of being super thoughtful about whether you even want to capture it or sort of collect it. Yeah, those are all really great points. Who else is looking at oh yeah, it looks like Pippa had a similar thought that you did around, and Pippa, please jump in too, around the differences in how people express themselves, and whether it's even possible to understand their inner state. Pippa, do you want to say a little more about that?
Oh yeah, no, I think Lila captured it beautifully. I just was going to say, people do express themselves in different ways, and is facial recognition really going to solve this problem? I think the use case should be reconsidered actually. Is this a problem to be solved by AI machine learning? How are we solving this problem today? What is the technology going to add? And if we don't know how to successfully solve it today, we can't just turn it into an AI problem and it'll magically be solved. So AI is not the solution to everything. It's a magic tool. But we have to know how to train the AI to make it useful. So I think we should consider how we're using this tool for this at all.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always a huge element, right? It's that concept of, is AI even appropriate for this? Is technology even appropriate for this? And is this even like, should you even go down that path? Absolutely, that's a huge question. Looks like Eleni, do you want to share? Kind of looking down.
Hi.
Hi.
So I said what I needed to say in the comments, but one thing that comes to mind, so my background is in philosophy. I used to be a philosophy professor. And when I think about how we do applied ethics, in addition to the rubric of concerns that you'd be tracking, we also have a series of case studies that you can go back to see when people saw these kinds of cases in the past, how do they decide? So instead of sort of brainstorming from scratch each time, we go back. And I wonder, is there a similar practice of having a case-based way of looking at things, where you look at past precedent to determine, sort of to track the kinds of concerns that come up over and over and over again? Or is that being developed? Has it been developed? If I were working in your field, could I look at cases like this in the past and start with a roster of concerns that have been foreseen already?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it just occurs to me, you say philosophy, we have a philosophy professor, ethicist on our team, and he's always, you probably studied a lot about the panopticon and all of those concepts before. So anyway, yeah, so that makes me think of two things. One is, in terms of precedents for, like when we say, when a product team comes to us, or we start working with the product team and they're like, hey, this would be really cool if we applied AI to this thing, it'd be really innovative. We really start with, how is this task being done now? How is it being accomplished with humans, with current tools, with whatever's happening? So what can we learn from that, right? What were the implications of that? How does it work? What's not working well about that? And is the thing that's not working about that something you can apply AI to? Is AI even good at that? Do we understand the limitations of what AI is even very good at? The kind of, I'd say, meta point about reflecting on past things and other sort of examples, one of the things that I'm doing as I've been running this harms modeling practice within the company is to say, for this type of tech, here's the kinds of harms we've identified, and here's the kinds of tools we've applied for that, and what do we learn from that? And so that next time someone comes and says, well, I want to use computer vision for this kind of scenario, I can say, okay, so when we did it over here, this is what we found as a harm. Let's validate that's true for you. And then let's figure out how we might, like, here's the techniques that worked really well over here. Let's try and apply them. Or here's these techniques that I saw that, Google did, or some other, other folks in the industry have done to make this more ethical, and like how we can, that's a lot of what our team does, is like just kind of gathering as much pattern and testing and feedback so we can feed it into the process, for sure. Yeah, it was a great question. I lost track of the scroll here. These folks up there. Who else? Is anyone else? I'd love to hear. It's like mostly worried. Let's see. There's Lenny. Nalini, do you want to share your inputs?
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I think I sort of second a lot of the comments that are coming in the chat right now. Emotions are subjective. They're based on context, culture, upbringing. There's so much nuance to how we express ourselves. And I worry that it's not just about representing it in the data set, but even just understanding and creating the right thresholds or what have you to determine what counts as something that needs to be taken an action on, right? What counts as being productive, what counts as being, yes, I need to alert this person now, or engage with this person in a different way. So there's just, the scope of harm is huge as I see it here. Even if we were to assume good intent from the company, that they do really want to encourage general well-being, sort of saying that we're going to monitor you 24/7 or whenever it is that you're online, and that's how we can enable general well-being at scale, is fundamentally flawed, right? So that's where I feel like tying general well-being to productivity, and then using a system like this to track and monitor either of those is problematic.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And one of the things, not to influence the crowd, but one of the things that sometimes we do come to that place of is saying, if we know that emotion detection is not effective, it's a proxy for proxy, and you can't know someone's internal state based upon external expressions, no matter what you think. Sometimes those are the kinds of things that we have to we bring our insights and our learning and research and bring that to the product teams and say, hey, I understand what you're trying to achieve here, but you're not actually going to achieve it with this, and you're going to cause more harm. So how do we try and get to what you're really trying to do, and like what's the method we could help. If well-being is the goal, you've decided emotion is maybe detection is a proxy for that, but let's think about really like what are more realistic indicators of well-being, if there are any, that we could successfully, safely detect and then provide guidance on. So yeah, those are really great points. Sometimes those are interesting conversations, and like you said, well-meaning humans who are trying to do something helpful, but sometimes you have to have those honest, frank conversations.
Yeah, and I also think that, one thing that a lot of these systems, especially facial recognition, emotion detection, or gait recognition, they tend to miss that humans are, sort of just grow into having a visceral sense of their environment, a visceral sense of the people around them. You can't automate that. You can't sort of represent that in an AI. And that's something that a lot of these systems tend to ignore when they're getting designed, and that's problematic too.
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent point for sure. Yeah, it's all those inherent innate things that are so human that you can't just replicate with a system. Yeah, absolutely. Checking time. So did anyone come up with any ideas for how you might guide, pivot, change this system, this case, this scenario, kind of understanding that the end goal is employee like wellness? Did anybody have any interesting ideas on how you might do that, how you might approach that? Let me scroll down and see if anybody has anything down here. Building trust is yep, opt in. That's a great point, Pippa. Yeah, self-reporting. Oh yes, those are so good. These are great ideas. Yes, yes, yes. Opt out by default, no penalty for opt out. Absolutely. Yeah, so I think we're about 5 minutes towards the end of this session. So yeah, those are the kinds of things, if we were presented with a scenario like this, that's the kind of thing that we start to do, is we start to say, okay, if your goal really is employee wellness, does the company need to be able to see this data? Does management even need to see this data? Or is there something that could you pivot it and do it in a way that allows someone to opt in and allows it so it's just a tool for that employee that they're allowed to engage with, that they're allowed to give signal on and shape and give feedback about and decide what's helpful for them or not helpful for them. Like, those are the ways that we start to try and engage with product teams on rethinking and sometimes even reframing how they think about the problem. Yeah, so I love these. Yeah, all of these things about making it a personal tool for employees. Exactly. Like, those are the kinds of ways you can start to, that we try to influence or try to sort of shift sometimes the thinking about how we're thinking about these products. So any last questions or thoughts? And then, so I want to preview that, and I'm happy to give you guys a couple minutes of a break too, because I know it's like, for those who've been on most of the day, it's a long day. Even 2 hours is a long. So essentially what we're going to do in the next session is kind of building on this initial phase, and you all have done such a great job. I'll present a new case study. And then what we'll end up doing is I'm going to break you out into Zoom breakouts and have you actually work through this motion together. So you can actually kind of collaborate and bounce ideas off each other and work through this new challenge set. And then we can come back together and have a discussion again, because I think this is really kind of helpful just to like get some reps with the process, engage with it, get your feedback, etc. So any questions before I give? I think we could do like a 5-minute and then jump back in.
Do you want to, so you want to let them know how they'll be just automatically put into breakout rooms?
Well, yeah, so we'll reconvene together. I'll present the case study, and then we'll automatically push you all into breakout rooms. My awesome team will help moderate the rooms, so you can bounce questions off of them as well, and your peers, which I think will be really fun. So.
Okay, so we'll set the timer for 5 minutes, take a little break, and then we'll come back here And Harmony will tee up the next section, and then you get to go in little breakout rooms with a facilitator from our team to really kind of dig in and really learn how to do this yourself. We're teaching you to fish.
That's right.
Okay. See you in 5 minutes, everybody.
Okay. Welcome back, welcome back. So, as we mentioned before the break, what we're going to do is I'm going to present another case study, and then we're going to have some fun in breakout rooms. So you all can engage with each other, bounce ideas, like have a little more time to like deeply think about how might you address this, or what are the areas that you want to like think about, what are the areas you'd want to explore more, what are the spaces, you know, what are the stakeholders you'd want to understand better potentially in this scenario if you were working down this path of trying to build it effectively and build it responsibly. Okay. So this next session, share please, thank you. Yeah, so really the goal here again, like we want to build reps, we want to get you comfortable with it, we want to give you time to practice it so that hopefully you can take it back and use it with your in your own practice with building technology and your own work. Give us feedback, share what you learn. Like we're sharing it because we want other people to use it and benefit if they can, but we also want people to try it and give us feedback and tell us what they discovered by using it, or how they, you know, what new ways they decided to approach technology. So we would love to hear back from folks. Okay, so this new case study is Health Chat. So a healthcare company has been experimenting with ways to use technology to improve public health through education and personalized guidance. So one of the initiatives that they've had in place for a while is they have this really popular weekly podcast hosted by a really well-known physician who shares her expertise, answers questions, and she's been really successful in helping the outreach team, helping to reach new populations, helping to reach communities, and been really successful in connecting people to guidance and resources to help elevate their own, you know, empower them to control their own wellness or know how to get resources when they need help. So the outreach team thought, great, let's think about how we can expand this and like continue to like reach out and engage with more populations. So what if we made an interactive digital assistant? And what if, let's work with an app developer, and let's say one of them would be great if we can like carry that personality, carry that connection from the physician who hosts this really popular podcast. So Dr. Lopez, let's have her voice be one that people can engage with when they're calling in or they're engaging with this bot or this digital agent. Because that way they'll kind of be able to carry that connection and feel that sort of real personal, you know, human element when they're engaging. It doesn't feel like a digital agent. The theory is people will be more likely to follow that guidance that they get from this agent. And then they thought, okay, so what if we also want to have this tool that can engage with children? And so what if, in this case, we, you know, we're able to use the voice of a popular cartoon character. Again, having something familiar that people can interact with, that children can engage with, that gives them guidance and recommendations on ways that they can be healthy and have healthy habits and practices in a way that's appropriate for children. So that's their goal. That's the big idea of the outreach team. I think this would be a great way to elevate community health. So a member of the outreach team, when they're talking this through with the developer, does express concerns about recognizable voices being used in the case. Like, what if there are errors in the guidance that are being generated by the AI agent? And what if people recognize that, like, associate that with Dr. Lopez and what that impacts her reputation? Also wondering, like, are people going to really understand that they're interacting with a digital agent? And how might they feel about that? What would they want to know? So that's the case before you. And we're now gonna, first of all, any questions before we dive in? Hopefully you all got the new file. Did that get dropped? Just toggling. Did we? Oh yeah, great. That's the new file. Okay, so if everyone can download the file And then we'll also share it into the breakout rooms. We'll go ahead and drop into the breakout rooms. And I'm going to give, let's do 20 minutes, and then I'll have the moderators let me know how things are going. But I want to give you guys the chance to really engage with this deeply, really again, think about how you might approach this. What are the different ways in either data or code or experience that you might be able to do this?
Okay, so welcome back, everybody. That was a little abrupt, but that's okay. We were all I know my group was in mid thought. So as soon as we have Harmony back, she can kind of land the plane, and we'll all sort of come together and share things out. But I'm sorry, that was an abrupt transition.
No, I'm glad you had.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're having vibrant conversations. That's awesome.
Poor Dee Dee was in mid-sentence. So
I hate that. I've had that with these breakout rooms. There's always the awkward thing. Even if you see a countdown, sometimes you don't see it, or it's you're mid. I've had that. It's so awkward.
All right. So Harmony, you take us home.
Okay. Yes. So welcome back, everyone. So I know I was in a breakout room, and we also had really vibrant conversations, and I'm just so excited to hear what people came up with. And so let's start with, I don't know if do you guys know what group you were in? If not, we can do it. I could start with group
Rachel was guiding.
Rachel
guiding group 1. Yeah.
Rachel, anybody from your group want to share?
Yeah, we have some awesome people in our group. I think if you guys from the group, Angela, Dee Dee, Eleni, want to kind of speak to what we were chatting about. It was really interesting. I can jump into if we have weird mic issues.
Some of the areas. Somebody from that group, we said Angela and Dee Dee.
People should be able to unmute themselves.
I think Dr. Dee Dee is unmuted. Do you want to share?
Sure, more than happy to. So we brought up a couple of points that the technology, the use of speech to text or creating a chatbot for an introductory medical information service, or something that seems like it's going to be providing really generalized information such as WebMD or what people will jump on Google to try to find out, seems a little heavy-handed. And in the event that it is created, some of the negative implications would be that it's not thinking inclusively of people with chronic illnesses, for example. They already have systems set up where they manage their illnesses properly, and they would need to have a direct connection to their physician rather than having generalized information. It's also not taking into consideration that different communities, different ethnic groups, for example, or cultures, they don't necessarily work on an individual me to physician process. It's more of a group environment. And then also thinking about the implications of the tech itself, it may not recognize different types of voices if that's how the information is being inputted to provide resources. And it brings up ethical questions or concerns around voice recognition if the voices are actually being replicated from other people or real people. It creates an ethical dilemma where that person could be identified, that person's identity could be stolen, and so on and so forth. And I can't remember a couple of the other points, but
no, these are all
happy
really
to let someone else jump in.
Really great issues you guys touched on. Yeah, the elements of, does it even work? If the interface is voice, does it work for a variety of populations, different vocal tones, qualities, accents, all of those things, super important, right? The last thing you want to have is to have a system misunderstand someone, give them wrong guidance based on a misunderstanding, or have someone trying to talk to something and it's I don't know what you said, right? That's miserable, especially if you imagine sort of if you're in a health, if you either have a health problem or you're uncertain and want guidance, in that state, right? The mindset of the people who are going through that, you want to be particular. I think the threshold is even higher, right? Those are the kinds of things about, right?
Oh,
then,
and
like,
then also the weight of whose voices are going to be used in creating the chatbots that are providing information. Is it going to be a diverse group of people, or is it going to be the de facto what we assume a doctor sounds like, which is white and upper class and male? That also brings in some implications culturally, and that could cause a lot of problems.
yeah, absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. And like, yeah, who's represented in the voice, and if it's a real person, what if it's gonna be like, if it's a real physician and it's giving bad guidance, how does that impact that person's reputation, right? And like, and you're right, if the whole goal of using a real human to create this voice bot that's realistic that people connect with is if the whole goal of that was to have people connect with it, but it doesn't feel like it's representative of them, if it sounds like that sort of like elite, you know, Ivy League white male, then it's probably not gonna like make people more likely to follow guidance or connect. No, those are amazing points. I love that element too of thinking about, you know, not all cultures have that individual relationship with a physician, and how would you think about that and understand that better? I feel like all of those, if you were even going to say like, let's try and do this in a way that's effective, all of those populations would be important to have research and engage with, and like really understand in a much richer way what their needs are and what's useful and all of that. Yeah, no, I love that. So many. Did you have any other ideas on parameters or how you might approach it, or any other thoughts you all came up with?
There was one interesting point that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
That, as a parameter that we talked about, was it seemed from the prompt that there was a lot of assumptions around the already the people who would be using it, while excluding quite a large amount of populations. So in terms of like stakeholders that should be taken more into account, talking about various, you know, people with varying access to the technology, maybe people who are mute and can't speak, or maybe people who are more naturally soft-spoken, that would have troubles, various accents and things like that to take into account, as well as the systems that are already set up that is like, well, what's the difference? Should we create a more robust package of this kind of thing?
Yeah, no, those are great thoughts, great elements. Catherine, were you in room number 2?
I was in room number 2.
To hear what you all, some folks from your group, see what they thought.
Yeah, so I have some notes. So just in general, there was some trust issues. So, you know, before we made a move to a lot of telehealth, there was, you know, the trust and the need for in-person visits. So having a rapport with the physician, so that may impact whether or not people want to call in to a doctor they've maybe never met in person, and whether or not that would affect how you know, the trust of you actually believing the diagnosis that would come out of the other end. When we talked about stakeholders, Dr. Lopez did come up, and I asked if, you know, it was a good thing or bad thing, and Allie's response was depends on the quality. And so you could think that, you know, if the AI was really, really good, that everyone's going to be like, oh, we don't need to go see Dr. Lopez in person, and no one sees her and her practice shuts down. But on the flip side, if the AI does really, really poorly, everyone's like, oh, Dr. Lopez is a terrible physician. Even though it's an AI, they're still going to describe the voice, and then her practice still fails. And so what is the stake that Dr. Lopez has? We also talked about the children. And so you kind of have the, I think it was Josh talked about like Joe Campbell, and you think about the cartoons in the 80s and 90s, and, you know, selling children on, you know, terrible things like cigarettes. But a great point from Allie was that, you know, if you have a diagnosis coming from one of your favorite cartoon characters, and it's, you know, traumatic and scary that this cartoon character is telling you that you're ill, every time you see that cartoon character now on TV, it's going to be scary, because you're like, oh no, that's the thing that told me about the terrible thing. And it's like, is that really the news that you want to hear from your beloved cartoon character? So interesting discussion about stakeholders. When we talked about harms, always the scams for money and data, Maybe if you see an increase in the number of calls about diabetes info for a particular neighborhood that gets sold to insurance companies, you know, apps are always talking to each other. What data is being used to actually return the results, so that gets to training, and what are the actual data that you're pulling from. The hackers, always going back to hackers. But for the mitigations, you know, talking about some sort of anonymity, so you're not actually saying, hi, I am patient number X accessing, you know, my, you know, group health plan or whatever. Also making it very clear at the beginning that this is not the real Dr. Lopez. So having some sort of upfront disclosure, really working upfront with the designers and the engineers to work on the, like, who's included in the building process and everything, and talking about how you collect the data and what cases you include, the scope of it. So we had a little bit of discussion about maybe you start small. So maybe you start with just like COVID, and then maybe like later on you move to just flu season, and then maybe you move to just hay fever season, and then from there you can scope out. And at the end, Ali was sort of saying, like, you know, how could, if you think about WebMD, how could WebMD go wrong? And then you can extrapolate that to this sort of scenario. So we had some great discussions. Ali and Josh, if I missed anything, feel free to jump in. But I think we had a good time. So.
Yeah, that sounds like really robust discussion. You got some really good mitigations. Really cool. Anything other folks from that group want to add? Okay, I'm just checking my list here. Josie, were you on group 3? Any folks from your group who want to share your insights?
Yes, I couldn't remember what group I was, what number we were, so thank you, Harmony. That was we had a really great conversation. Had Katrina, Chavi, Layla, Pippa, and Mariana in our team in our breakout room, and we talked about like quite a huge, you know, range of things, going from, you know, talking about the transparency of when this technology would be used and is that clear to the person using it, through to the consent of the person whose voice is being used. And also Katrina made a really interesting point about, well, is it a voice that has been synthetically generated, or is it a voice that has been generated from a human who exists in the world? You know, and what are the different ethical issues we need to think about with those two categories of voice?
Did you guys dig into those, of saying, like, did you come out on one side or the other versus like
I don't know if we came out on one side or the other. Katrina, do you have anything you'd like to add? That was such a fascinating point, because Katrina is involved in podcasting, and so Katrina's voice is, you know, out in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And we also talked about. Sorry,
I guess just to kind of build on what Josie was saying, I think that there is a difference when you take the, you know, like, let's say someone took my voice as a data set and then generated something specifically from that to sound like me, versus an actual, you know, synthetic voice. So if the person who is consenting to that, you know, the broadcaster, that's one thing. But if it's just out there, you know, what are the responsibilities and rules around that? We did talk a bit about biometric data, and there were some other people in our group who made some really good points around regulation and compliance, and there are laws around this.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love to have your perspective on this. If we shift briefly, I want to tap into it since we have you. If we think about sort of your domain of expertise and where you podcast about, would you imagine, like, is there any scenario you imagine where if we created not we, me, but if someone created with your consent a synthetic version of your voice that sounded just like you and could generate answers to something or responses around your area that you didn't necessarily control? How do you think, have you thought about that in terms of like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it gives me pause for concern. It's one thing for, you know, a person to dispense advice, and it's another thing for your voice to be used as a data set. And how is that advice being crafted? Would I have said that? Is something that would I have any, you know, agree with that? And then there's no ability to kind of redress that issue. Like, once it's out there and your voice is on it, it might as well be you. So I think I think there's some problems with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I love to ask the question because I'm super interested. I think that's like the emerging issues with synthetic media that does sound realistic. Like there's benefits to it, and then there's all of these issues, right? Of saying like, well, if you don't specifically type and tell the voice what to say, then it could represent you in a way that you didn't intend. Yeah, right. I love this. Any other big ones you'd like to share, Josie, or other folks from that team? This is great. I love hearing these insights.
We also had an interesting conversation about whether this is the right tech to solve this problem. And Layla in our breakout space talked about an example where she worked on a chatbot with some young people, and they actually didn't really like using a speech function. They wanted to just do everything via text. So even just having that speech function wouldn't work for them, for example. So, you know, is it the right tech to solve the problem? And we also talked about deep fakes as well. And I think this has been covered by other groups too, but you know, that idea of like liability, if something is shared in error or something is shared that's inaccurate and there's that person's voice attached to it, what does that mean? And again, we talked about compliance too. So yeah, and is there anything else that anyone from the group would like to add into that?
All right. Awesome. Oh, I love this. This is one of my favorite things. I love to hear the different, like one of the reasons why I love running these models with product teams is I like to like prompt these really deep thinking about complex issues. And it's even more fun with a group of amazing humans who are already like thinking about ethics and really deeply in this space. So this is so much fun. Sharon, I think you were leading group or engaged and moderating group 4.
I was, and I'm going to happily pass the potato to Alyssa, Claire, and Nalini, because I think you guys all brought up really awesome points, and just we had such diverse backgrounds, some from product, some like different countries, different continents. So I just want to bring it all in. So if one of you guys want to speak to some interesting things you felt like were brought up.
Okay.
Right.
So I won't remember everything that was said, but we talked a little bit about how this app might impact health providers in general, especially the public ones. So for example, if the app was in general quite cautious and recommended people go and see their physician, then it might actually involve an uptick in the use of medical services and the use of those resources. And that could have serious impact nationally. And we also, I think one of the things I like best about our discussion with Sharon posed a very interesting question of if the app was really, 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 really accurate, would we still have a problem with the human voice? Or is it really just like about the fact that there are false positives and false negatives may impact it in different ways? And one of the things we discussed was people might believe that it was human and might believe their conversations were therefore covered by doctor-patient confidentiality when they weren't. And that could be really misleading, even if the app was completely accurate in terms of diagnostics. But I don't know, Alyssa or Nalini, I don't remember some of the other stuff we talked about.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was lots of different topics covered. So you're right, I may not remember all of them. But one of the things that stuck out for me was, the conversation we had around over-reliance on something like this and how the harms exponentially increase as you rely more and more on something like this. So if it gets it right, for an entire year, and then at the most critical time it gets it wrong, is that harm bigger than if it gets it right like the first or third time that you use it? And how do you quantify?
No, that's a really great point. Yeah, it's like building the trust. The more, if it's accurate for a period of time, it may even build a false trust, even if you try and warn people. But then down the road, when it gets it wrong that one time, that's could be incredibly impactful. That's a great thought, great insights.
Especially as over time.
Sorry, Claire.
Especially as over time, like medical knowledge might change and people might not know how up to date the app is kept.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's another great. No, that's good. That's a great insight as well. I'm curious. Did any of you consider kind of splitting the scenario? Consider sort of proactive wellness tips versus kind of reactive. Someone is coming because they have a question or concern. Did you think any differently between those two or similar?
Yeah, we actually did. Claire was giving an example where, receiving information in a timely manner sometimes is helpful, especially for situations where you're dealing with something like a pregnancy, for example. Sort of timely information is useful. You can sort of change things around and make it better for yourself because of that. But shifting from there to actually solving a health issue through a chat is a whole different context of the harms, right? So considering those two situations differently and saying maybe, well, it's okay if it's just giving me information, but if I'm going to actually actively engage with it to solve a problem, then that's different and probably more harmful.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's really interesting thinking. This is good. Oh, I love this so much. So I want to make sure we have one more. Breakout room 5 had Sangi and I, as well as Susanna. So I'd love to tap Susanna because she had some really great thoughts and insights. Susanna, are you still here?
I think it was more along the lines of trust, because if the chatbot was made into an avatar or a virtual representation of my own doctor, then whatever advice it's giving out, it's going to give me an additional layer of trust, because it's coming in the voice of my own doctor. Then I'm going to assume it is accurate as well as it's trustworthy. And then on the other hand, if I'm just using it to ask details about an allergy or something very simple, and then it is giving me some advice based on Wikipedia or whatever WebMD, and then says, drink some tea, drink some ginger tea or something. I know that advice is not from my doctor, because my doctor would know the specific allergies I have to some things, and then he may not be giving out that information, but then this chatbot might be trying to tell me something in his own voice, which is going to contradict everything. And then on the other hand, if it is personalized, then what kind of data is being given out to this chatbot? That will go against the HIPAA guidelines of this state and even any other guidelines in medical privacy. And then we talked about, I didn't see a good use for it in any scenario. The only one scenario where I saw a potential use case could be reminders, medical reminders to take your medicine, or to come for your doctor's appointment. If that comes in my own personal doctor's voice or avatar or anything related to him, then that's like very, very personalized, and it has some bigger impact on me, like my own doctor calling me or telling me to do this. That is the only use case I see for this avatar or virtual assistant in my own doctor's image or voice or likeness. But in every other case, I don't see a good use for it, because it builds an additional layer of trust, which is not a good thing. It could give out wrong information, it could be misleading me, and anything that comes in their voice or anything would be detrimental to our health. The other area that I was talking about is this an area where we actually need to be working on the technology? Instead of focusing on the scalability of accessing doctors, why not focus on making their job easier? If we actually automate all their paperwork, all of the other junk that they are doing all the time, then they will have more time to talk to me. Then I don't have to automate this part. So the focus of technology should be on automating things that are non-essential, that that don't need the human element. Wherever the human element is needed, don't automate that. Don't try and put your thinking in your brain cells into automating something that should remain human always.
Yes, I love that point so much when you brought that up. That's so foundational, right? Of should we even do this? And is this even the area to automate? I love that.
Thank you.
Any last inputs, any last thoughts from folks? This is a really great discussion. I hope everybody found it really valuable. Danielle added a link. So in addition to the PDFs that hopefully you all have, we also published a more depth kind of guide to using this harms modeling technique on our external Azure Docs sites. And so Danielle added the link to that on here. So hopefully people can use it. I would love to hear back from folks. I am on Basecamp, or I will be on Basecamp. So if people have questions or people want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I really want to hear feedback from people. I'd love for people to engage with the technique and let us know what you find. Danielle, any closing thoughts on your side?
No, just a huge thank you to everyone who hung in there. This was a really dynamic, amazing experience. It was kind of an experiment, and you all did great. And it's the beginning of an ongoing dialogue and relationship. So please stay in contact with us. We want to hear from you what happens when you take this practice back to your teams. We are where we have as much to learn from you guys as we, vice versa. So please take this, make it your own, and let us know how it goes, and let's keep the dialogue going.
Yeah.
Now I wonder, is Mia gonna take us back?
I think so.
Is there, Mia, you're on mute.
Hi there. Can you hear me?